A massive shout out to the Genin tier member of this channel. Thank you Aliyah Ra, your support means a lot. If you would like your name mentioned in every video, as well as receive special perks and soon having early access to new series, consider becoming a member of this channel by hitting that join button. There's a rumor going around. If you like this video and subscribe you will be reach Super Saiyan 4, if you become a member you will be able to combine Super Saiyan 4 with Ultra Instinct. Hi guys, this is the next part of What If Naruto Had the Most Powerful Ice Zanpakuto Hyo Rinmaru. I hope you enjoy. The crowd was eerily silent, staring at him openly with surprise on their faces. Even the Hokage seemed flabbergasted, his pipe hanging from his lips limply, lifelessly. The Kazekage showed no outward signs of emotion, no one would have seen it because of the mask, anyway, merely locking his stony and eager gaze on the child that had stumped the crowd. He shrugged. He honestly didn't care what the crowd thought of him, or what the foreign dignitaries judged of him. It wasn't a part of his personality to care. It was far too troublesome to worry about FTHE opinions of others, so he thought, why bother? That was his take on the majority of things in the world. He frowned. Lately, things had become much more troublesome than usual, simply because of one person. Word spread like wildfire in a village as populated as Konoha, so much so that a new rumor was common knowledge by the next morning. That made things even more troublesome, especially when you took in the subject of those rumors. Ever since the preliminaries a month previous, Naruto had been the subject of debate and rumors amongst the ninja and civilians of the village, popping up in even the oddest of conversations. For a while, even, it seemed as if Ino couldn't choose between the new and improved Naruto and Sasuke, the one she was supposedly in love with. Some of the rumors about the boy were truly absurd, bordering on clinical paranoia. Some thought that the Snake Sennin had returned and claimed the blonde as his new apprentice, teaching him the ways of the sword and plenty of new jutsu. They thought that he'd given Naruto his weapon and taught him how to use it. Others thought that he had made a deal with the Kyuubi no Yoko, which was truly amazing to him. They thought that the demon was plotting its revenge on Konoha for being defeated by the fourth Hokage and humiliated the way it was. He had trouble understanding their logic, simply for the fact that he'd been told all his life that the demon fox had been killed. Some even thought, and Shikamaru nearly shivered at the idea, that Naruto was the reincarnation of a dragon god whose domain was ice. Their idea was that the dragon Naruto summoned with his sword was his true form, that was locked away within his human body. Those people had built a small shrine near the river, praying to it that the dragon god would be freed from his mortal prison. He knew their ideas and theories were absurd and ridiculous, but he couldn't completely discredit them when he himself didn't know the truth. It was all too troublesome, but his curiosity wouldn't let him rest until he'd discovered what exactly was happening. Naruto, who he had thought was one of the boring, uncool guys like himself, was quickly becoming one of the genius prodigies Konoha celebrated so much. So troublesome, huh? Genma asked incredulously, his Senbon threatening to fall from his loose lips. He looked as if he'd been told that the Tsuchikage of Iwagakure wore pink underwear decorated with pretty red hearts. Wha? Temari stuttered, her eyes wide and her mouth dropped open in shock. He was half tempted to tell her she'd catch flies if she didn't shut it. What did you say? That's right, you heard me, Shikamaru said lazily. I quit. It was fun and all, but this wouldn't last much longer, anyway. I'm almost out of chakra. In fact, I think I've got enough to hold this for another 10 seconds, tops. What? Temari asked, dumbfounded. You mean that, after all the talk about not losing to a girl, and after all the trouble you gave me, you're forfeiting? Throwing in the towel. Must I repeat myself? Shikamaru retorted rudely, his shadow retracting from her form. There, you happy? I couldn't fight back even if I wanted to. You win. Genma started slowly, as if the words refused to leave his lips. His eyes were still wide as he continued, trying to force the next phrase into the air, winner, Temari. Everyone tensed as a whirlwind exploded a few feet from Shikamaru, kicking up a thin cloud of dust. Leaves that had not been there before danced about the high-speed winds, some crumpling under the pressure. In a quick burst, the winds dissipated, revealing two figures back to back as the leaves slowly fell to earth. The first person was tall, nearly twice as much so as his shorter companion. He wore navy blue under a green flak jacket, a mask hiding most of his face. A Konoha Hitai-8 was slung over his left eye, hiding the socket beneath. His light gray hair spiked up, as if defying the laws of gravity. His hands were nestled in his pockets. The second person was a boy easily half the older one's age, no more than 13 or 14 at best. His bangs were long and parted to frame his face, easily reaching to the very edge of his jawbone. His dark eyes were observant, flickering about the stadium as a small smirk quirked at the right side of his lips. His raven black hair spiked backwards at the back of his head, kind of like the hind end of a chicken. Naruto smirked, cupping his mouth with one hand as he leaned against the steel railing. "Hey, Sasuke." The younger of the two figures looked up, his expression remaining mostly neutral as the blonde continued, "What's the sword for, compensation?" "I don't know, Naruto," Sasuke called back, a smirk on his lips as he lightly fingered the hilt of the ninjutsu strapped horizontally to the back of his waist. "What's yours for?" Instead of responding, Naruto grinned broadly, a challenge flashing in his blue eyes. Sasuke seemed to read the look correctly, seeming surprised for a second before the smirk returned full force. He nodded, hoping his blonde rival had understood that he would gladly match blades whenever the Chunin exams were over. Feeling a pair of eyes on the back of his head, Sasuke turned slightly to look behind him. Gaara's imposing figure stood in the stands, his eyes stony and dark, as if he were staring at his next prey. Sasuke flinched for a second as Gaara's face split into an evil and maniacal grin, one that threatened to crack his head in half. He blinked in surprise and the grin was gone. He repressed a shiver. This guy was beyond creepy. He felt a bit of his confidence drain at the prospect of facing this madman. He hardened his resolve. He was an Uchiha. A single genin like Gaara wasn't going to shake him. He would fight, and he would win. Sorry, Kakashi addressed the examiner, scratching the back of his head sheepishly. "We got kind of sidetracked. He's not disqualified, is he?" "No," Genma smirked. "You guys were really late, but we pushed his match back to last. As a matter of fact, we should probably be starting by now." "Oh, right," Kakashi said, vanishing in a puff of smoke, only to reappear in the stands. Temari and Shikamaru followed his lead, heading back upstairs as Gaara appeared from the stairwell and walked calmly towards his opponent. "Don't lose to this guy, Sasuke," Naruto muttered as Genma stood between the two genin. "Now, finally," Genma said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Begin." As sand burst from Gaara's gourd, Sasuke jumped back, watching what his opponent would do from afar. He only knew what Kakashi had told him, nothing more. The rest of his opponent's skills were a mystery to him. The sand seemed to flinch, wriggling as if in agony. Gaara grasped his head in pain, muttering, "Don't be so angry, Ka-san. That blood I gave you earlier, it was disgusting. But I promise, this blood will be so much better." "What the?" Sasuke's eyes widened slightly. "What the hell is he talking about?" "TCH, Sasuke scoffed as Gaara flinched again, cringing. Then the calm facade had returned, Gaara's empty teal eyes glaring at him from rings of black. The redhead's brow furrowed as his lips drew tight, his arms folded in his typical fashion. The sand was calm, floating around the boy smoothly. "Come," the boy uttered lowly, his voice dangerous. In a blur, Sasuke dashed towards his opponent, kicking up a trail of dust as he moved. He flung two shuriken, watching as the sand rose up and grabbed them out of the air. It morphed into a copy of Gaara, glaring at him with the two shuriken grasped in its fingers. It exploded outwards and Sasuke leapt up, tossing two more of the throwing stars as the Gaara clone tried to use his previous ones against him. They collided with each other and fell to the ground. Sasuke landed, punching a hole through the doppelganger, the sand grasping at his wrist. He brought his other hand up in a palm strike, blasting the sand clone's head to bits. He rushed forwards again, aiming a punch at the redhead's face. The sand rose to block, but Sasuke vanished, reappearing behind Gaara. To his opponent's shock, he landed a solid punch on the Suna shinobi's left cheek, sending him flying. The sand formed a cushion for Gaara, standing him back up as it repaired the damaged section of Suna no Yoroi. Gaara's glare seemed to intensify. "That speed," Guy remarked in surprise. He turned to his eternal rival, Kakashi-san. "You." "I did," Kakashi nodded. "I focused on the fight happening below. I had him imagine how Lee would fight and copy it. Needless to say, he picked it up quite well." "I see," Guy said seriously. "But you do realize that pure taijutsu won't be enough for this, don't you? Even my brilliant pupil couldn't beat Gaara-san with taijutsu alone. Taijutsu isn't all I taught him," Kakashi remarked lightly, revealing no secrets. Sasuke-kun and I are very similar people. In a blur, Sasuke was upon him again, landing another punch. It hit and he continued, lifting himself and Gaara into the air as he went. A second punch, an elbow to the gut, a knee to the solar plexus, and a palm strike to the left chest. He grabbed the boy's white sash and tan strap, swinging his head forward and into Gaara's. Using his opponent's shock, he twisted around, throwing him into the ground. Sasuke landed lightly, panting heavily. Gaara stood slowly, but Sasuke allowed him no reprieve, punching him squarely in the jaw with enough force to leave a crater in the wall. Gaara flew backward several feet, landing on a soft cushion of sand. He stood slowly as his Suna no Yoroi slowly began to flake off, revealing the pale flesh of his face. The sand swirled, forming an orb around him as he moved his hands into a single seal. There were several surprised gasps in the crowd, mainly from the team of sand ninja that Gaara called comrades. That alone drew Naruto's attention as an ominous feeling settled into his stomach. Jin, Saru, Hubby, Saru, Gaara chanted within the orb, hands locked in a hand seal. Sand trickled upward and formed an eyeball that stared out at Sasuke. Jin, Saru, Tori, Tatsu. Sasuke scowled, glaring at the orb in front of him. Wary of this new technique, he tossed a shuriken towards his foe, watching as a spike of sand shot out from the sphere and destroyed the small throwing weapon easily. His scowl deepening, Sasuke dashed towards the orb at amazing speeds. Nezumi, Saru, Jin, blood trickled down Sasuke's cheek, fist, and left leg, spikes of sand protruding from the orb just barely having missed impaling him. He had come far too close to losing a body part there, and he would have if it hadn't been for his Sharingan. He jumped backwards, doing several flips before he landed on the arena wall, sitting on it like a stool. I have two options, Sasuke told himself, and Kakashi warned me to only use that as a last resort. Chidori it is, then. Nezumi, Usagi, Tori, Jin, nodding to himself, Sasuke flashed through three quick hand seals, bracing his left arm with his right hand. Chakra gathered, quickly turning into a blue lightning that fizzled loudly. The sound of 1,000 birds chirping filled the area as Sasuke crouched on the wall, prepared to make a fast dash. Guy turned to Kakashi in shock. Kakashi-san, you didn't. I told you, Guy-san, Kakashi said in a firm monotone, Sasuke-kun and I are very similar people. Then, to the eyes of the roaring crowd, Sasuke became a blur as he ran full speed down the wall, a trail of destruction left in his wake. As he hit the ground, he continued forward, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. The crowd roared even louder as Sasuke closed in on his opponent, his Sharingan allowing him to dodge the spikes that shot towards him. With only a fraction of resistance, Sasuke's hand cut through the barrier of sand surrounding Gaara, passing quickly through the sphere and striking the red-haired boy within. All was quiet as the crowd waited with bated breath for the result to show itself. What's this? This warm moisture? Gaara's voice asked, confusion and fear running rampant. Blood, is this my blood? An ear-splitting shriek rent the air, the cry of a dying man. The crowd slowly fell asleep, lulled by a genjutsu cast by a traitor amongst their number. Several Konoha shinobi broke it easily, moving to intercept the disguised sand and sound ninja. An explosion obscured the cage box from view and several Anbu were already making their way to help. Hinata twisted, cutting her opponent down in a brilliant flash of steel. She spun slightly, her sword slicing cleanly through a kunai and down her enemy's middle, splitting him open from eyes to crotch. He fell to the ground, screaming as his damaged heart slowed to stop in the open air. Bile rose in Hinata's throat, but she refused to give up now in this most important of times. She would not die, not now, not when she had yet to tell Naruto how she felt. There were too many things she still had to do before she could die. Tobirame whispered soft words of comfort in her ears and she steeled her resolve. Another enemy rose up to attack her, arms spread wide as if a tiger pouncing on his prey. Hinata moved fluidly, faster than her foe could follow, and stabbed forwards as he tried to grab her. Her razor-sharp sword sunk into his chest, destroying his heart in an instant. He went slack, dead before he could react. A battle cry called out behind her and she spun around, pulling her sword free as she twisted her body. Her wrist flicked downwards, carrying her blade in a diagonal arc. A neat, thin line carved itself into her enemy's body, but Hinata had no doubt that it was very deep. He fell to the ground, screaming as he slowly bled to death. Hinata took pity on him and severed his spine at the base of his neck. Another enemy came and Hinata severed his head, watching with barely concealed horror as the body thumped to the ground lifelessly. Tears stung her eyes as she turned and slit the throat of her next foe, wishing she could turn her Byakugan off so that she didn't have to see their faces, immortalized in pain at their death. A chill ran up her spine as Dragon of Ice leapt over her shoulder, engulfing every one of the enemy ninja around her in a column of frozen water. It even stripped the flesh from some of them, bearing raw skin and sometimes even muscle or bone. She felt her heartbeat quicken, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what that dragon meant. She struggled to hide her smile. A black-clad figure followed the dragon, landing a scant few feet in front of her with his sword drawn and his gaze stony. He pointed a single finger at the row of frozen ninja, energy gathering at the tip rapidly. In a solemn, serious voice that she rarely heard him use, he said, "Hado no Yan, Byakurai." A bolt of white energy tore a large hole through each of the ninja, killing them instantly. The ice, however, prevented the blood from spilling out over the ground, catching all of it and keeping it inside the bodies. Naruto suddenly spun around, thrusting his sword at her. Alarmed, she watched as it rushed past her shoulder and into the heart of another enemy. He had saved her. Then, he did something that nearly brought the girl to her knees. He kissed her on the forehead, pulling her into a tight hug as she felt her eyes widen to incredible size. A feeling of warmth pooled in her belly, uncoiling from the depths of her middle to envelop the entirety of her body. Belatedly, she realized he was whispering something in her ear. "Be careful, Hinata-chan," he said to her, his breath tickling her ear. "Make sure to stay safe, all right?" "But, Naruto-kun," she protested quietly. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to follow Sasuke," Naruto said firmly, his eyes hard like diamonds. He has no idea what he's in for. "But," Hinata protested, worried for his safety, "what if?" "Don't worry," he told her, smiling slightly. "I'm going to be just fine." There was an explosion deep in the forest, and suddenly Naruto had let go, telling her, "Got to go. Stay safe." In a flash, he was gone, leaping over the stands and into the woods. Within seconds, he was out of her line of sight, maybe even for the last time. Belatedly, she whispered, "Good luck, Naruto-kun." As another enemy leapt towards her, Hinata swung her sword, releasing a bulging ball of energy in a cry similar to a firework streaking through the sky. In an explosion of pink, her enemy, as well as several of the seats surrounding her, was no more. Sasuke leaned up against the tree, clutching the junction of his neck and shoulder as the pain racked his body. Little flame-like black markings crept over his skin, consuming almost the entire right side of his body. His chakra was at an all-time low and he was too tired to even think of drawing his sword. He had lost to the demonic Gaara. He grunted as another wave of pain washed over his aching body, tensing as his worn and sore muscles twitched in time with his agony. His eyes shut, clenching tightly as he bit his lip, drawing blood. A pain-filled screech threatened to tear itself from his lips, but he wouldn't let it and it came out as a sort of stressed gurgle. He panted, glaring over at the sand shinobi who was taking so much glee in his pain. That maniacal grin that Sasuke had seen for but a split second just before their match was back in full force, stretching over Gaara's face and threatening to crack the boy's head in half. An insane chuckle escaped those lips, bloodshot teal eyes glaring at him with enough bloodlust to kill small animals. Sasuke wasn't sure how it had come to this, how it had come to him being the one losing. During their match at the stadium, he had been in control because his Chidori was powerful enough to punch through Gaara's defensive sand. That had led to Gaara running away and Sasuke following him into the forest. After he had caught up with the wounded Gaara and his teammates, Kankuro had decided to stay behind and fight him. He had been prepared to take the puppet user down fast and hard so he could follow the redhead, but Aburame Shino had shown up and claimed that he had never gotten to have his fight in the finals. That had allowed Sasuke to bypass the puppeteer and follow the blonde girl carrying Gaara. He thought that he would have had to fight the girl before Gaara, too, but the sand user had simply pushed the blonde out of the way and went insane. Sasuke had grinned eagerly, ready to settle the fight they hadn't gotten to complete during the exams. He had expected to clinch a victory rather easily, since Gaara was susceptible to his Chidori. The fight had gotten so much weirder after that, though, and Sasuke wasn't entirely sure just what had happened. Gaara had done something really strange with his sand, something Sasuke hadn't thought he had enough control to do. Gaara had turned his sand into an arm, a tail, and half of a raccoon's face, one gleaming golden eye glaring out at him. Sasuke had thought it was strange, but hadn't paid it much mind, to be honest. No matter what distortions the sand genin made to his body, Sasuke figured that it still wouldn't make much of a difference in the long run. His Chidori still held a certain measure of strength over Gaara's sand, and no amount of bodily enhancements with the stuff would change that. Or so he had thought. Sasuke tensed again as another wave of pain swept over him, biting his cheek to keep from screaming out. The pain reached its apex and Sasuke let out a low groan as he tried to keep himself from crying out. The pain suddenly spiked, to the boy's shock, and he couldn't help the scream that left his lips, aaaaagh. As it turned out, Gaara was pretty much immune to pain in this new form of his, and that made it a whole lot harder to fight him. Sasuke had severed the sand arm with his Chidori, thinking that would be the end of it. Gaara, however, had merely grinned insanely as his gourd expanded and morphed again, reforming the arm of sand effortlessly. Up until that point, Sasuke had been relying on his own strength and power. He became desperate, however, when it was obvious that he wasn't strong enough on his own. He had called on the power of the curse mark, Orochimaru's Heaven Seal, in an effort to take down his powerful enemy. In the end, his efforts had proven useless and pointless and had done nothing but waste his chakra in a futile effort at victory. He wasn't sure what exactly was going to happen to him, but he figured that Gaara was going to do what he seemed best at. He was going to kill Sasuke with his sand, like he was known to do. Strangely, that didn't bother Sasuke even half as much as he had expected it to. Despite the fact that his goal in life was unfinished, he was somehow at peace with the fact that he was going to die. He may not have revived his clan or even killed Itachi, but he was going to get to see his mother again. Sasuke leaned up against the tree trunk, letting out a peaceful sigh as the thought entered his mind. The curse seal receded as it lacked energy to draw on, the black markings fading from his skin at the peaceful thought. Despite the fact that he was going to die, he was going to see his mother again after 5 long years. He would get to see her smiling face again. He sighed again, closing his eyes as he braced himself for Gaara's murderous touch, gently murmuring, "Mother." Gaara suddenly backed up from Sasuke's relaxed body, stumbling as he grasped at his head, as if in some sort of agonizing pain. He let out a groan that was more like the whine of an injured child, his eyes wide in pain and fear. He bit his bottom lip, tears welling up at the bottom of his eyes as that one word drew up memories he had long since repressed. "Your mother loved you very much," a voice told him in his mind, the image of a blonde-haired man appearing in his mind's eye. The man was smiling at him lovingly as he bandaged the small cut on his hand. "And I loved your mother, my sister, very much, Gaara. And that means that I love you, as well. Yasha, Maru," Gaara said in a small voice, the tears threatening to spill. "There's only one thing that can heal a wounded heart, Gaara," the voice continued, the astral Yashimaru resting a hand on Gaara's chest. The smile was gentle and caring, the man's calm blue eyes staring into Gaara's hurt teal ones, gazing upon the redhead with affection. "The only thing that can heal a wounded heart, Gaara, is love." Gaara let out an ear-shattering shriek as he reared his arm of sand back, glaring at the boy sitting in front of him. He brought his gigantic fist down, crying out, "Die, Uchiha!" "Ruler," a voice called. "The mask of flesh and bone. All creation, flutter of wings. He who bears the name of man. Truth and temperance, upon the wall of sinless dreams unleash but slightly the wrath of your claws. Hado no Sanjusen, Sokatsui." Gaara's arm suddenly became a makeshift shield as he brought it up to block the ball of blue fire rushing towards him, intent on frying him to death. It exploded against the sand, scattering a large chunk of the arm and revealing Gaara's real arm. In an instant, the arm reformed again, but Sasuke was nowhere to be seen. Gaara looked up, glaring at the blue-eyed blonde that had stolen his prey away from him as those sapphire orbs pierced his soul. The 8-petal lotus design on the circular clasp for his green sash gleamed in the light streaming down from the canopy, the gold seeming to burn a fiery red as it reflected the bright ultraviolet. Gaara's eyes narrowed, his teeth bared in a snarl. This boy dared to steal his prey away from him. He dared to get in the way of their match, just as Gaara was about to prove his existence. He dared to stand up to Gaara as if he were something special. A growl bubbled up in Gaara's chest, rising to the surface ruthlessly. I can see that you're not going to back down, Naruto sighed, reaching up for the hilt of his sword. If you're going to go any further, I'm afraid I have to intercept you. Naruto leapt into the air, unsheathing his sword in an instant as he swung downward, Soten ni Ace, Hyo Rin Maru. A blue dragon made of nearly frozen water was unleashed, its gaping maw wide as it rushed toward its target. Its red eyes stared at the sand ninja, fangs of liquid bared in a dark snarl. Gaara thrust his arm of sand forward, pushing it against the nose of the beast aimed to encase him in ice. The dragon engulfed the entire arm, splashing around the limb as it continued into the tree branch beneath the redhead. When the dragon had subsided, it left behind several spikes of ice on the branch and bark, each of which was thick and dense as they refracted the light streaming through the canopy. Gaara looked down at his arm in shock to see that all of the compacted sand had disappeared and his sleeve had been torn off roughly, leaving bare, healthy skin covered in a thin layer of frost. Sand rushed as Gaara growled, thrusting his palm toward Naruto again as a paw grew from his gourd. The paw crashed through thin air as the blonde disappeared in a soft whoosh, reappearing behind Gaara with his sword poised to stab. The boy's blue eyes were dangerously serious, like icy chips in the frozen sea. Senga, Naruto said coldly, pushing his sword forward. It sank into the sand a few inches, the tip moving to impale the redhead's right shoulder. Naruto's eyes widened, however, as the sand swirled and grabbed his steel tightly, preventing further penetration. Gaara looked back at him, teal eyes triumphant. Naruto could see now why Sasuke had lost to the insane shinobi. Gaara's control over his sand was beyond impressive. In fact, it was far greater than the control that Haku had had over water and ice, and Haku's control had been very impressive. Against Gaara, Sasuke, who was better at close-range attacks than anything, would lose quite quickly. Naruto, however, had far more tricks up his sleeve than Sasuke. Sasuke had only focused on learning one technique over the course of the month while Naruto had learned many, even some that none had ever seen before. Those techniques were what would give Naruto his great advantage over Gaara. Sprinkled on the bones of the beast, Naruto's free hand came up, pointing to the trapped sword. Sharp tower, red crystal, steel ring. Move and become the wind, stop and become the calm. The sound of warring spears fills the empty castle. Hado no Rokujusen, Reikoho. A blast of yellow energy was fired, point blank, into the sand covering Gaara's shoulder, blowing it away. Naruto pulled his sword free as Gaara let out a loud scream, his voice shrill and pained as the agony of Naruto's spell set in. Vaguely, Naruto could see raw red skin beneath a hole in the sand ninja's shirt. He moved to make another attack, but stopped as Gaara's shriek of pain tapered off into a maniacal laugh that lilted through the trees, ringing in the tall forest canopy. Naruto watched warily as Gaara turned around, the sand around his arm and face mutating until both arms had become monstrous sand limbs. The Uchiha was nothing, Gaara said insanely, an insane grin threatening to split his face. In you, I have found a true measure. You are my prey. There was a sudden gush of sand that burst outward, crushing trees as it took on a solid, corporeal form. Gaara disappeared in the large mass, his form hidden by the dirt, dust, and rock particles that made up his attack style. Naruto jumped backwards as the massive ball threatened to engulf him too, watching as it took on a definite shape. Purple markings covered the entire body of the creature, strange and almost like some sort of cultic tattoos. The tail was thick and had multiple protrusions, as if it were some kind of mace used to club enemies to death. The teeth were jagged and replaced any form of lips that may have once existed. The eyes were a dull gold surrounded by a sea of black. Naruto scowled as the beast turned its eyes to him, a wicked gleam in the depths of the diamond-shaped pupils. The tail wagged slightly, bowling over several tall trees and kicking up a cloud of dust and dirt. Icy blue met gold as the opponents sized each other up, taking in each other's forms. Fangs of sand curled into a wicked grin. Naruto stabbed his sword into the tree trunk, flashing through hand seals as the beast focused all of its attention on him. The air around him swirled and the ice chunks that had frozen next to Gaara's body melted, twisting and morphing in midair as Naruto manipulated them to his will. He stopped on the final hand seal, bird, and watched as the water he had gathered took on a specified form. He shouted, "Suiden, Suiryuden no Jutsu." The dragon leapt at the demonic creature, smashing into its right foreleg. It pushed with all the might it had against its target, attempting to pull the demon's leg out from under itself. The beast merely scowled, doing nothing but watching as the water dragon fizzled out, revealing an uninjured leg. I see, Naruto sighed. So that's how strong this guy is, huh? The heir remained silent, giving no answer to his question. I guess I'd better step it up too, huh? He grasped his sword tightly, gathering energy for his own transformation, of sorts. I imagine I'd be using the stupid fox's chakra if I didn't have you, Hyorinmaru. His eyes sharpened into glints of steel. Time to use the technique you taught me. Orochimaru chuckled, tearing the fake face off in a display of rubbery flesh as the Sandaime Hokage looked on in barely suppressed disgust and horror. He smirked cockily, golden eyes flashing in triumph as 3 wooden boxes started to rise from the tiles of the building. The entirety of his plans began to merge as the shock on his former teacher's face turned to vicious determination. Sarutobi flashed through hand seals as the coffins rose, watching in satisfaction as the first 2 tilted on the roof, preventing the third from rising up. He breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the final coffin would have released a foe even he would lose to almost instantly. It was bad enough that he would be facing his former teachers, but to face the 4th Hokage, he would be doomed. It wouldn't have stopped with him, though. If the 4th, Namikaze Minato, the famous Konoha no Kiroi Senku, the yellow flash of Konoha, had been successfully summoned, then Orochimaru would not have stopped at merely killing his sensei. No, Orochimaru would have continued on to the village and nothing would have stopped him. If the Snake Sennin had managed to bring back Minato, Kakashi, the man's student and a powerful asset to the Leaf, would have been unable to react in time to do anything. He would have been too overcome by shock and grief to fight back and would have been annihilated before he could do anything. Most of the village's shinobi would have similar reactions. If Orochimaru had succeeded in reviving the 4th, then the entire village would have been doomed. Jiraiya, who had recently returned for a small duration, might be able to put up a decent fight, but it was still doubtful that the man would defeat his previous student. The old man's eyes narrowed as the 2 large boxes creaked open, the lids falling to the roof tiles with a loud thud. 2 figures stepped out from within, each wearing his own version of battle armor on the chest and arms. The first had long, smooth black hair held from his face by a Konoha Hitai-8. The second had spiky white hair held back by a helmet, similar to the one that Yamato, a trusted Anbu, wore. He also had 3 red marks on his face, 1 horizontal on each cheek and 1 vertical on his chin. The Shodai and Nadaime Hokage. It's been a long time, the Nadaime said, monkey. The Shodai mused. You've grown old, haven't you, Sarutobi? I would not have thought I would meet with you 2 brothers again like this, Sarutobi said grimly. It's regrettable. Please make your preparations to be defeated. How about you forget the chatter and get started? Orochimaru asked in annoyance. He pulled out 2 kunai, each tagged with a strange paper, and inserted it into their heads. Instantly, any and all injuries on the 2 Hokage dissipated into thin air with a hiss of steam, revealing flawless skin and sturdy armor that both looked brand new. Orochimaru grinned, stepping back as the Shodai and Nadaime regained all of the health they had lost when they had died. Let's get started, shall we? The third rushed forward without any warning, flashing through hand seals as he drew closer to his new enemies. He stopped on Tiger, taking in a deep breath as his chakra churned and morphed. He blew out, mentally chanting, Kaden, Karyu Enden. A thick, powerful stream of fire raced forth toward his foes, incinerating several roof tiles in a blaze of flames. The Nadaime went through his own set of seals, calling, Sweden, Sujinheki. He spat out a torrent of water that swirled around the 3 ninja to form a thick barrier, protecting them from harm. The fire-style skill collided with it powerfully, sizzling out as the water began to evaporate under the intense heat. As the Karyu Enden dissipated, the Nadaime went through more hand seals. He stopped abruptly on Bird, the water swirling to take a draconic shape, Sweden, Sweryuden. The third flashed through his own set of hand seals, spitting out a huge globe of mud that quickly formed a barrier between him and the water dragon intent on destroying him. He named the technique as the dragon crashed into it, breaking down into its base element, Doden, Doryuheki. The Shodai sped through a set of his own seals, muttering, Mokuden, Jukai Kuden. The Sandaime jumped atop his tall barrier wall, going through yet another sequence of seals as thick roots wound their way towards him. They grabbed onto him just as he finished, wrapping him in a thick bondage as a plume of smoke arose in front of him. An ape appeared, clothed in shinobi garb and a tiger skin pelt, a Konoha Hittite wrapped around his forehead and pushing back his thick white hair. He turned serious eyes from Orochimaru as he looked back at the one who had summoned him. You're pathetic, you know that, Sarutobi. This is all because you didn't kill him when you had the chance. That's what we're going to do now, Sarutobi told him. Enma, use the Kongonyo. Right, the ape spun, another plume of smoke arising to cover him, transform. The Monkey King's form shifted, turning into a large staff as it cut through the tree roots binding the third Hokage. The Sandaime grasped the huge, thick pole as he fell free, glaring down at his traitorous student, Orochimaru. The Snake Sennin merely smirked up at his old teacher, confident of his victory. The Snake Man's mouth opened, revealing one of the slimy serpents, which, in turn, opened its own mouth to reveal the hilt of a sword. Orochimaru grasped the hilt, pulling it loose to reveal the legendary Kusanagi no Tsurugi, Ku no Tachi. His smirk widened as he brandished the sword in front of himself. Sarutobi jumped off his stone wall, crying, "Let's go, Enma." He landed, rushing forward and taking a swipe at his foes. The Shodai and Nadaime jumped over and ducked under his weapon respectively, watching as the third thrust Enma forward. The pole extended, crashing into Orochimaru's sword as the Snake Man blocked it. The two Hokage under his command reacted, kicking the Sandaime backwards where he fell onto his butt. Please don't disappoint me too much, Orochimaru smirked. A sizzling sound interrupted anything else he might have said as two explosive notes, one on each of the Hokage, exploded in a burst of smoke, destroying the former Fire Shadow's legs. Orochimaru laughed as the legs reformed. Your breaths seem to be coming rather fast, you know. The Sandaime sighed, setting Enma down as he made his seal. The exchanges of jutsu end here. Naruto tightened his grip on his sword, the blue cloth rubbing comfortably against his palm. The energy in his body gathered as he prepared himself for his next maneuver, staring down the hulking form of the massive Gaara, or whatever he had become. The power surged as he pointed his sword forward, his body glowing white. The large beast stared him down with a familiar look on its face and in its eyes, one that Naruto had seen on Gaara mere minutes before. The look was decidedly creepier on a huge, demonic beast than it was on a person as wicked fangs of sand curved in a maniacal grin. The beast's huge stomach twitched as a soft chuckle hissed past its teeth. A single word left Naruto's mouth, one that no one else in the world would understand. His lips curled to fit the syllables as they came out in a dense, solid uttering, Bankai. A bright flash lit up the area, nearly blinding the large beast that was Gaara as the blonde boy's energy output flared and spiked nearly beyond belief. Within the beast of sand, the red-headed shinobi felt something that had not existed in his heart since the days when Yashimaru had been alive. Not even the Uchiha's attack in the stadium had brought it out. Fear. A trickling doubt wormed its way into his mind as the bright light began to fade and a shivering breath left his mouth. The golden eyes of the foe Shukaku locked onto the area his prey had been seconds before, widening as its gaze found something truly remarkable in the world of shinobi. Several trees were frozen over, covered in a dense ice as a fine mist hovered over them. There, within the trees and not having moved from his spot, stood the powerful blonde boy whose aura saturated the air in a thick fog. Beyond anything the sand shinobi had seen before, Naruto had changed nearly as drastically as he had. Wings of ice spread outward, maneuvering with amazing ease considering their composition. They were attached to the Konoha Genin's back, covering his shoulders with a protective layer. Beneath the wings was a large tail of ice that flicked back and forth, as if it belonged on the boy. A thick layer of jagged ice covered the blonde's right arm, encasing his fist and the hilt of his sword in a dragon's head. His feet were covered in ice as well, forming what appeared to be a dragon's paws. His left arm, from elbow to wrist, was also covered in ice, a claw-like paw attached to the wrist. The hilt guard on the sword appeared to be the only thing that had changed about the katana, morphing into an 8-point star. 4 ice flowers, each with 4 petals, hovered around the blonde's form. Naruto's eyes were frigid blue, Daiguren Hyo Rin Maru. Great crimson lotus ice ring. Before Gaara could react, Naruto had leapt off of his branch and started, flying towards him, sword brandished threateningly as he let out his war cry, "Ah!" His sword sank into the sand, penetrating the raccoon demon's shoulder as he cried, "Die! Ryuzenka!" Instantly, a trail of ice leapt forward, cutting across the beast's back and into its hind leg, freezing and encasing a large amount of sand. Naruto pulled his sword loose, crashing the blade against the ice, shouting, "Kudakero." The ice shattered into hundreds of large chunks, falling to the ground and taking with it a good portion of the Ikibi's fine-grained body. Surprised, Gaara tried to regain the sand by forcing it from the ice that had spontaneously formed the moment Naruto's sword had penetrated his sandy and admittedly fragile body. He could not pull the grains free. The sand moved and twisted as Gaara's head and torso appeared from within the Shukaku's giant body, glaring out at the blonde that posed so much of a threat to his existence. He gathered chakra, forming a single hand seal as he named his indirectly fatal technique, Tanuki Niri no Jutsu. Instantly, Gaara collapsed, asleep where he was as he allowed his demon free run of his body in the sand he commanded. The huge beast instantly perked up, growing slightly larger as its eyes took on a brighter golden hue. Yahoo! I'm free. The beast turned its gaze to Naruto, who was floating in the air as if he were standing on solid ground, and I've even got prey sitting here waiting for me. The demon swiped at him with its paw, as if it were swatting a bug out of the air. Naruto did a mid-air barrel roll, cutting into the beast's paw as it passed him. Instantly, the entire paw froze over, falling off of the arm as if it had been amputated by an expert surgeon. A second later, the paw reformed as if it had never been missing. Naruto dodged out of the way of another swipe, cutting once more into the sand and watching it freeze a second time. Again, the missing part reformed almost as soon as the original fell off. A third swipe in retaliation brought much the same result, and Naruto soon realized that he was running out of options. He stopped moving, bracing himself for the next swipe. The gigantic paw loomed over him and came forth at astounding speed, considering its remarkable size. He pulled his wings in front of himself at the last second, blocking the attack as it hit him full on. The blow sent him flying into the shrubbery, where he collided with it painfully. Shukaku grinned when his opponent hit the earth and did not get back up afterwards, staying on the ground. He didn't care that he couldn't see the little gnat, and he wouldn't pretend that it hadn't been annoying to have so much sand cut from his body, but he had won in the end. So much for the foe that Gaara had so much trouble with. Shukaku turned towards the village, which he could see in the distance, and prepared to move towards it when a voice rang out, one that he only knew through his fragile vessel, Bansho Isai Kaijin Tenace, Ryujin Jaka. It came without warning, a searing heat that could easily burn the entire forest down should it be directed in such a manner. It came up his right foreleg, cleaving it right up the center and quickly moving up towards his shoulder. He turned an angry golden gaze to the boy that dared to attack him, watching as the tiny figure ran vertically up his arm. In his hands, the boy he knew to be Uchiha Sasuke held the hilt of a katana whose blade was surrounded by what seemed to be a solid aura of fire. The fire burned straight through his foreleg, cutting almost cleanly in half and leaving behind two thick walls of glass. The boy jerked his sword out, black eyes blazing with hate as he jumped up and reversed his grip. With a battle cry, he dove towards Gaara, sword poised as he reached the apex of his jump at quite an impressive height. Shukaku growled, slamming the pest with his damaged arm and shattering the hot glass as it collided with a massive tree trunk. The boy disappeared into the foliage and Shukaku had serious doubts that he would be getting up. The huge beast turned back around and started to walk forward, its golden eyes refocusing on the village of Konoha in the distance. It stopped short, however, at the figure standing on air calmly in front of it, glaring at him with just the hint of a smirk on his lips. Shukaku was too stunned to do anything. "I have to thank you, you know," Naruto told him calmly, a victorious gleam in his eyes. "Only 3 flowers remained. If you hadn't left me alone for as long as you did, I wouldn't have had the time to do this." Naruto's sword rose until it was perpendicular to his torso, the flat sides of the blade perpendicular to the ground. Quickly, and before Shukaku could do anything to stop them, several pillars rose from the ground until they formed a makeshift cage around the beast's body. If it tried to escape, it would have to jump over the pillars, and, for a creature of its large size, that would be nearly impossible. Naruto turned his sword so that the flats of the blade were parallel with the ground, Senenhiro. Shukaku reared back as the pillars rushed in and trapped him, locking him in a thick, square prison that left only his head free. Immediately he could see the effects of the technique as ice crept over his form at an amazing speed. He extended his neck as much as he could, screaming as the ice consumed all but Gaara. Naruto landed atop the great beast's raised snout, staring down into the dull eyes as Gaara awoke and started to panic. Naruto brought his sword up above his head, then swung downwards, stabbing his blade into the frozen creature beneath his feet as a cry left his lips, "Ha!" For a second, nothing seemed to happen as Gaara screamed and writhed in his prison of ice. Then, hairline cracks formed from the point of contact, slowly and steadily thickening as they began to move deeper through the tall beast. With a loud snap, the ice prison and Shukaku both shattered into thousands of tiny shards and Gaara fell to the ground. Naruto gazed down at the spot where Gaara had fallen, seeming to think something over for a few seconds. In a blur, he disappeared from his place in the air. For the size of his body and the weight that the tail and wings had to add, he moved at an incredible speed. He reappeared in a small clearing, Gaara's teal eyes going wide as Naruto materialized several feet from his weak and vulnerable form. The blonde turned his gaze towards the redhead, his expression unreadable. Gaara shrugged his shoulders alternatively, trying to back away from the monstrous power in front of him. "Stay away," he cried, backing up one meager inch at a time. "My existence will not vanish." Calmly, Naruto walked up to the downed boy, who had, by this time, managed to lean himself up against a tree trunk. His eyes widened as the blonde poised his sword to strike. With a fearful grunt, Gaara closed his eyes as Naruto's gleaming silver steel came rushing towards him. He prepared himself as best he could for the pain of pierced flesh and the blackness of death. It never came. Hesitantly, the Sand Shinobi opened his eyes, looking to his left, where Naruto's blade was embedded in the thick bark. His gaze flickered over to his opponent, watching as the wings, tail, feet, and dragon's head made of ice crumbled and evaporated into thin air. The calm determination on the blonde's face had not changed at all. "Why?" Gaara asked, even as Naruto bent over him and started checking his wounds. "Why didn't you kill me?" "I killed." "No, you didn't," Naruto told him calmly, his voice quiet. "As long as a person is alive, no matter how much chakra they have, they will continue to emit Raryoku in a small but constant stream. Sasuke's Raryoku has yet to vanish." Gaara listened but didn't really understand. "Why are you?" "Wounds of the flesh can be healed, Gaara, it just takes time," Naruto interrupted him again. He sighed, hand glowing white as he tended to the redhead's injuries. "Wounds of the heart, though, can only be healed with love." Naruto leaned back as he finished. "I look in your eyes and I see what I could have been if I hadn't been shown any love or compassion." Gaara listened intently as Naruto continued, "If it hadn't been for the old man, I'd..." The blonde's eyes suddenly widened to impossible widths, startled realization fluttering across his face. "Shit. The old man." There was a sharp flare of chakra and then a second Naruto puffed into existence, kneeling dutifully before the original. Naruto turned a calm cold gaze to his doppelganger. "Take Gaara somewhere safe and wait out the invasion. Use force only if you have no other options." With a nod, the shadow clone picked up the shocked redhead and slung him over its shoulder, disappearing in the soft whoosh of Shunpo like a curtain fluttering in the breeze. Sensing it move beyond his perception, he turned his gaze toward the wavering Raryoku that he knew belonged to the old man. "Are you going to use that?" Hyo-Rin Maru asked him calmly, its smooth underbelly pressing lightly against his bare arm. "I have to," Naruto responded, not even moving his eyes. To him, Hyo-Rin Maru materializing next to him was an everyday thing. "I've almost completely drained my Raryoku. Between fighting Neji, Bankai, and healing Gaara, I have got very little left." "I see what you mean," came the reply, the dragon conceding his point. "Yet, your chakra." "My chakra is mostly untouched," Naruto finished for him. "I have since recuperated what I lost during my match with Neji. The last significant drain was when I used that Suiryuden against Shukaku. I've recovered the majority of what I lost to that, as well." "I see," Hyomaru said, turning a serious gaze towards the blonde. "You realize, however, that this is untested. You only saw the Toad Sage's technique once. That's all you managed to bribe out of him." "I know," Naruto sighed. "Are you ready, Hyo-Rin Maru? This skill will merge us far further than we were originally meant to." "I am as prepared as I can be," the dragon answered honestly. "If this is irreversible, then so be it. We shall die and that it is that. I am prepared to back whatever decision you make. If death is the price we must pay to save those precious to you, then I know you will gladly pay it. I am prepared to pay that price as well." "Good." Naruto flashed through several hand seals, his fingers blurring beyond recognition. Blue eyes were sharp as he finished, naming his technique, Kinjutsu, Ryujin no Terai. Chakra flared as Hyo-Rin Maru vanished from his side, melting into his body instead of fading from view. Round pupils thinned into slits, the blue irises deepening into crystal navy. Muscles twitched as chakra enhanced them artificially, strengthening them beyond normal human limitation. The flesh of his right shoulder blade beneath the black vest rippled, tearing through the fabric as it morphed and twisted. Feathers appeared, stretching over the growing flesh sprouting from the blonde's shoulder. A few seconds later, a wing covered in pitch black feathers was folded proudly against his back. The transformation ended and Naruto stood straight, flexing his new appendage as he inspected the changes to his body. So this is 50%, eh? He mused, his voice slightly deeper. We guess 100% would give us 2 wings, but we don't think this body could take the stress of the full technique. He grinned slightly as he clenched his right hand, an audible hiss of air escaping between his fingers. Arrow Sennin's, Sage Mode, has nothing on this. Now, he scolded himself in a much deeper and calmer voice. No matter how impressive this technique may look, we still wouldn't be able to fight one of the Sannin head-to-head. Gently, he lifted off the ground, hovering effortlessly. He grinned, so, when we're using the power of a dragon, whether Bankai or this form, we can fly under our own power without the need for wings or such the like. His expression became serious as he turned his gaze toward the Chunin exam stadium, his altitude steadily increasing. Hang on, old man. We're coming. In an explosion of movement, he soared off towards the Sandaim's flickering and fading Raryoku. He would not let the old man die, no matter what it took. Sandaime coughed up blood, grimacing as he glared at Orochimaru. There was no need for me to dodge the blade. This jutsu is a forbidden skill that costs the caster his life. It is a powerful sealing jutsu that stopped even the biggest threat Konoha had ever faced. What? Orochimaru hissed. You don't mean, the Kyuubi no Yoko. Damn you, old man. The Sandaime suddenly blinked, looking at something behind his wayward student with surprise. Orochimaru twisted his head around, shock flitting across his face as he looked through the translucent purple barrier to see the face of the one he least expected floating several feet off the ground. An angry Uzumaki Naruto stood with his sword drawn, reciting an incantation. Sprinkled on the bones of the beast, he cried, pointing both palms toward the barrier. All creation, flutter of wings, move and become the wind, stop and become the calm. Truth and temperance, upon this wall of sinless dream unleash but slightly the wrath of your claws. Hado no Sanjusen and Rokujusen, Sokatsui Reikoho. As Naruto broke through the barrier, Sandaime saw his chance with Orochimaru's distraction and tugged harder on the snake Sennin's soul, watching as it would be pulled no further than the perverse man's precious arms. His dark grimace deepened as Naruto's seething form hovered into the barrier, which closed up behind him. If you hurt the old man, the blonde spoke in a voice slightly deeper than normal. Sarutobi wondered for a brief moment if perhaps the Kyuubi had taken over, but dismissed the thought when he could feel no foul energy. We'll kill you ourselves. That stole the Sandaime's attention for a moment. Naruto was speaking as though he were 2 people merged into one. The old man's eyes flickered to the black feathered wing protruding from his favorite genin's shoulder and he wondered just what had happened to the boy. There was a power exuding from the boy that was easily Jonin level, though it most certainly couldn't match the power he and Orochimaru were capable of. A thought entered his head unbidden as he recalled who had been teaching the blonde for the better part of a month. Had Jiraiya taught the boy a technique to match his Sage Mode? The third mentally shook himself free of such thoughts, knowing that Jiraiya would never be so irresponsible as to teach such a dangerous skill to a mere genin. Sarutobi shook himself from all thoughts pertaining to the blonde, knowing that they wouldn't matter in a moment or two. He would have to trust that the next Hokage would help the boy with any problems he had. Now, the old man turned his attention to the astral arms in front of him, tugging on the evil man's soul once more. It didn't budge. I guess this is my limit. Were it not for this sword, I would be able to take all his soul. Damn. It doesn't matter. He cried aloud, tugging as hard as he could one last time. He managed to pull the right shoulder out too, guaranteeing that he was taking 2 arms in a long. The seal is set, the end is now. Shiki Fuin. With a hiss that only the caster and the target could hear, a gleaming silver blade came down and severed the left arm, right shoulder, and right arm from Orochimaru's soul, sealing them inside the Sandaime's body. With a dark sizzle, the seal pattern drew itself on the elder man's torso as he fell backwards and Orochimaru's arms began to blacken. As Sarutobi hit the roof with a soft thud, Orochimaru's arms fell to his sides limply. Naruto rushed to the third side as the snake Sennin stared at his useless arms with something akin to horror and disbelief. Even before he kneeled down, though, Naruto knew instinctually that the old man was dead and gone. One of his precious people had died. "You senile old fool," Orochimaru yelled, glaring at his former teacher and ignoring Naruto. "Look what you've done. Come back to life so I can kill you again." Orochimaru, the snake Sennin stopped his rant as Naruto stood up, his voice cold. The blonde turned, frigid blue eyes freezing the evil man in place. "We warned you, that if you hurt the old man," a vicious aura lit up, surrounding the boy in a white haze, "we'd kill you ourselves." He moved forward to attack, sword poised for the snake man's heart. Before he could make it there, however, a fist slammed into his body and sent him crashing into the tiles beneath him. They cracked and crumbled and Naruto slipped into unconsciousness, his black wing evaporating into the air. Sakin stared at the blonde for a moment, then rushed forward to help his master as the barrier collapsed. The other members of the Sound Four did likewise as the Anbu came down on them, swords set to kill. Kidomaru knocked them back as his comrades moved on, then followed them swiftly. The Anbu cursed as they pulled at the webbing that tied them down. No more than a minute later, the wide lavender eyes of a Hyuga widened as their female owner rushed to the aid of her most precious person. Thankfully, all he suffered from was exhaustion and some minor bruising. Sabaku no Gara would later stumble into the Konoha hospital, searching for a certain blonde that had extended a hand of friendship. He would remain by the boy's side for the entirety of his remaining stay. It was a most dark day in Konoha as the Sandaim's body was carried away. A most dark day indeed. The room was dark, luminous numbers glowing from their place in its occupant's alarm clock. The windows were closed, covered by curtains to block out the daylight that would normally stream in. The entire room was silent, save for the quiet breathing of its owner and tenant. Clothes were strewn all over the floor haphazardly, laying on the surface over top of the hard wood. The door to his closet was ajar, showing the world all of the outfits he had stashed inside of it. They were all identical: a black sleeveless turtleneck vest, a pair of loose black pants, a black belt with a silver buckle, and 2 black sandals. The bed sheets were a simplistic white, pristine and clean amongst the messy room and dark clothing he normally wore. The pillows were large and fluffy, though he had bought them at 3 times the normal price. He had saved up 2 months' worth of his biweekly stipend from the Hokage just to buy those pillows. The bright blue letters of his alarm clock read 9:52 a.m., glaring at him through the blackness of his room. Sunlight, bleak and weak behind the dark clouds in the sky, tried in vain to break into the inky gloom, blocked by the heavy curtains over the windows. Dim Sapphire stared dully at the floor. These feelings, he thought to himself, his expression blank, what are they? An image flashed into his brain of a dark-haired girl with pale eyes, her face lighting up in a fiery blush that no amount of her willpower could quell. His heart skipped a beat, as though it thought about quitting its job as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Those pale lavender eyes lit up in happiness, a small smile breaking over the girl's face. 3 days had passed since the Sandaime had died, leaving behind a village without a Hokage to protect it. 2 days afterwards, he had woken up in the hospital with a concerned Hyuga hovering over his bed and a bouquet of flowers on the nightstand next to it. He had been discharged a few hours later. Truthfully, nothing had actually been physically wrong with him. Besides a few bruises, he hadn't had any wounds, and even if he had they would have healed quickly. He hadn't broken any bones, so there was nothing to set. He hadn't even had so much as a measly little paper cut. There hadn't been anything wrong with him. Except exhaustion. Hinata had told him that he had been admitted to the hospital with a severe case of chakra exhaustion. The doctors had said, according to her, that he was so low on chakra, he was likely to slip into a coma. Thankfully, though the doctors had known this, the Kyuubi wouldn't have let something like that happen. What threw him for a loop was that the doctors actually treated him like a normal patient. Ever since he had gotten home, however, he had been thinking about one thing and one thing only. Hinata. Or rather, how he felt about her. It was confusing, just as much as it was soothing. He hadn't felt anything like it before, not even with Sakura. Chasing after Sakura had been a plea for attention more than anything else, though there had been some measure of attraction to it as well. With Hinata, however, things were so much different. He was suddenly noticing things about her that he hadn't before. Her blush was suddenly a blush and not a fever, and it was suddenly cute as well. Her eyes were no longer creepy, but oddly pretty and majestic, like some sort of rare jewel. His perception of her personality had changed as well. Before, no more than a month ago, he had thought of her as that dark, weird girl. Now, she was shy and timid and peaceful, but strong and graceful at the same time. There was a certain beauty to her as well, like he was staring as an angel every time he looked at her. "I've never felt this way before," he muttered to himself, eyes narrowed as he stared at the floor like it was the most interesting thing in the world. He tried to imagine something happening to her, something horrible. He tried to imagine Hinata on the edge of death, gasping as the life left her eyes. An unthinkable despair took hold of his heart, clenching it tightly as a thick block of ice plopped into his stomach like a glacier swaying in the sea. He imagined a tall man with dark hair and pale skin, yellow eyes with slit pupils laughing at him as the man bared his teeth in a triumphant smirk. He imagined that this man, Orochimaru, was standing over the dead Hinata he had imagined earlier and felt an insurmountable rage take hold of himself. He squashed the feeling mercilessly, like a bug beneath his shoe, reminding himself that it was all a part of his imagination. Still, the dark and vengeful emotion lingered, and would linger until he avenged Sarutobi's demise. He pushed the thought away as guilt and pain threatened to consume him, moving towards his original train of thought. "Why?" he asked silently, his mouth forming the words as no sound escaped. "Why do I feel this way? There comes a time in every man's life where he must admit that the truth is," Hyorin-Maru spoke to him quietly, "he's fallen in love." "Fallen in love?" Naruto echoed, equally as quiet. "I don't know about that." The dragon did not reply, vanishing into thin air as a knock echoed throughout the small room. A second later, the door opened to reveal the somber form of Hatake Kakashi, his little orange book conspicuously absent from his hands. Dressed in a black funeral uniform, his sensei looked every bit the morning man he was supposed to be. "Naruto," the serious and ominous tone to Kakashi's voice shook Naruto from his reverie. "It's time." Nodding numbly, the blonde stood up quietly, slipping on a pair of black sandals as he went. Silent as a ghost, he followed his gray-haired sensei out of his apartment and through the streets. He knew what the older man had meant with those 3 words. He had been trying to avoid thoughts about the event for the sake of his sanity, but, eventually, the real world came back to bite you. It was time for Sarutobi's funeral. "It's raining," Naruto noted quietly, watching as, one by one, the large procession stepped up to the casket and laid a white lily or chrysanthemum atop it. Each of them said his or her goodbyes quietly, so as not to disturb the thoughts or grief of others present. Each and every person was wearing identical black uniforms, dressed the part of mourning friends and family. Rain poured down from the heavy black clouds above, soaking all that stood in front of the large wooden box that held their sandaime. It was fitting, Naruto thought, that the heavens would cry for the old man when he could not. He had run out of tears in the hospital, crying on Hinata's shoulder. Dull Sapphire watched the proceedings with a soft apathy, their owner silent as thick globs of water pattered against the hard ground. A dense droplet ran down his nose, dripping off the edge and falling to the stone below. His thoughts were a chaotic mesh of guilt, pain, and confusion. The only sign of the torrent of emotion was the twitch of his lips. By all accounts, he supposed that he shouldn't be placing the blame for the old man's death on his own shoulders. But he couldn't help but feel as if it was his fault the Sandaime Hokage had died. If he had been a little bit stronger, if he had been just a little bit faster, he may have been able to save the grandfatherly man. Logically, he knew that no amount of extra strength would have helped him defeat Orochimaru in time to save the old Hokage. The elderly man had gone into battle with no intention of surviving to see the next day. He had known that he would die facing down Orochimaru, and he had died knowing that he had protected his village the best he could. Naruto sighed almost imperceptibly. That didn't make it any easier to say goodbye to the elderly ninja, though, and there was still a small amount of guilt telling him that he could have saved Sarutobi. The hardest part was watching those closest to the old man suffer in their grief. Konohamaru sobbed a few feet away and Naruto wished he could comfort the young boy, but knew that nothing he could say would dry the boy's tears. Iruka was explaining death to the kid, about how people's dreams and beliefs died with them, but they continued to live on in the people who were precious to them. If possible, Konohamaru's sobs seemed to get louder. Looking around, Naruto noticed that Kakashi had disappeared from the crowd, as though he were a specter that had guided his student here, and then vanished into the wind. Naruto frowned in thought, and then realized that his teacher was probably visiting the memorial stone that he had told his students about. Naruto felt a small bit of pity for Kakashi, knowing that the older man had lost so much already. To lose the Sandaime, a grandfather to all that lived in his village, it must have been a harsh and painful blow. Naruto sighed. He doubted Orochimaru would ever realize or regret just how many people he had hurt that day. He turned his gaze, watching as Hinata lay a white flower atop the coffin, then bowed to it, her lips moving silently as she said something to the dead Hokage. As she stood again, she turned and walked away, following her family back home. Faintly, he could see pearly tears hovering at the edges of her eyes. Finally, after what seemed like hours, it was his turn. He had no flower, as the parting gift he would give Sandaime would be a little more lasting and permanent. Slowly, the eyes of the procession on his back, he walked up to the thick wooden casket. For a long moment, he only stared at the smirking face in the picture. He held out his empty hand, knowing that everyone was watching him like a hawk. He focused chakra, almost frowning as every ninja present tensed at his action, and concentrated on what he was going to do. Slowly, the particles of water in the air condensed and twisted to his will. A shape began to form. After a few seconds, the water flowing over his palm and dancing as it shifted. The rain seemed to bend around the object that was forming, or else it merged with the water already there. Finally, after a minute of intense focus and concentration, a perfect rose made of ice sat in his hand. Imbued with his chakra and made from his special abilities, it would never melt. "I know that you probably can't hear me," he set the flower down, knowing that everyone was listening. Light reflected off the ice, "but I'm going to miss you. You did a lot for me, and for this village." He sighed. "I know, you died the way you wanted to die. You died defending the village. But that doesn't make it any easier for you to be gone. Konohamaru won't stop crying, you know. He keeps begging me to do something, to bring you back." He chuckled lightly, "But I wouldn't, even if I could. Something tells me that you're finally getting some much-deserved rest. I wouldn't take that from you, force you back into our world, so full of responsibility." He sighed again. "I know that you'd tell me not to and that you'd lecture me that it wouldn't bring any closure or satisfaction, but I'm going to do what I feel I need to anyway. I'm angry at you, old man, for leaving behind so much pain. But I'm angrier at Orochimaru." His eyes sharpened. "I'm going to kill him." The Hokage's eyes suddenly seemed stern and accusing. I know, vengeance isn't worth it in the end. I'm not doing it just for me. I'm doing it for all of the people he hurt by killing you." He bowed, then stood straight again. "Next time I see you, I'll be as old as you are, Hokage-sama." With his part said, he turned around and walked back towards the rest of the procession, feeling their eyes on him. In a blur and a soft swoosh, like that of a curtain billowing in the wind, he disappeared in front of everyone. He reappeared walking down the empty street, rain splattering against his clothes and hair, dripping down his face. His eyes had returned to their dull sapphire, staring listlessly at the wet, soggy streets that seemed to stretch on forever. The roar of droplets pounding against the hard earth filled his ears with a loud buzz. "Hey, kid," a familiar voice called quietly, halting his walk. He looked up to the direction of the voice, his dull blue eyes blinking as rain bled into them. Jiraiya stood leaning up against the wall of a shop, his arms folded across his chest and his chiseled face set in a serious look. The older man's frown was grim, his hair somehow dry while the rest of the world was wet. Naruto frowned himself, turning away as he made to move onward. He was going to go back home and try to forget the dull, throbbing pain he felt, even though he knew it would take time to fade. His mouth moved of its own accord. "Go away, Ero Sennin. I don't have time for your nonsense right now." "I heard what you said," Jiraiya told him, stopping the boy in his tracks again. The Toad Sage's eyes narrowed as he spoke his next words. "Do you really intend to kill Orochimaru? That's not an easy task, you know." Naruto paused, mulling over his own words as he tried to find the best way to address that question. He took a deep breath, and then let it out in one huge sigh. "Yeah, I'm going to kill that snake bastard, no matter what it takes. It might not be easy, but I'm going to do it anyway." The blonde's fists clenched shut tightly, his fingernails digging into the fleshy skin of his palms. Blood leaked over his fingers, falling to the ground and mixing in with the dark rain water, for all that he's taken from me. For all that he's taken from the village. For all that he's taken from Konohamaru. And for making Hinata-chan cry. I'll kill him. There was a thick silence as his words hung in the air, then Jiraiya sighed a deep, exasperated sigh. Against my better judgment, Naruto, I'm going to ask you a favor. It's not something I would normally ask of a genin or even most chunin, but I think it's something you can handle. Naruto eyed him skeptically. What is it, Ero Sennin? Jiraiya's eye twitched at the nickname, but he pretended to ignore it. I'm going to look for my teammate. We need her back here for something, so I have to go find her and convince her to come back. Would you come with me? You said you were reluctant to take me, if not in so many words, Naruto said, eyes narrowed. Is that because we're going to see Orochimaru while we're gone? Jiraiya shrugged. There's a chance that he'll search for her to get his arms healed, but the chances of us actually meeting him are slim. Naruto looked at the ground. Slim is still good enough. Alright, I'll come with you on this trip of yours, but you better teach me some more jutsu. When do we leave? Tomorrow, Jiraiya said, so get your things packed as soon as you get home. Meet me at the front gate at 10 sharp. In a poof of smoke, the older ninja disappeared from his spot, leaving Naruto alone once more on the streets. Turning back around, Naruto vanished from where he stood in a blur and a soft swoosh, like that of clothing fluttering in the breeze. Two pale eyes stared worriedly at where he had been a mere second before. The sun rose, casting light on vibrant blonde hair. Birds chirped in the distance, greeting the morning with an enthusiasm that no one could match. Wind blew through the tall trees and their leaves, ruffling the hair of the young ninja standing still, ready for the next chapter in his life. The blonde boy smiled brightly, breathing in the rich summer air and inhaling the scent of nature so plentiful around his village. Lightly, he fingered the strap of his pack, marveling at the amount of strength he had gained since it weighed so little to him now. When first starting his mission to the land of waves, it had seemed so heavy and cumbersome. Now, it felt almost weightless. He loved nature, simple as that. It might have something to do with the elemental dragon that shared his soul, and it might have something to do with the demon fox sealed in his navel, but the smell and presence of nature always made him feel better, no matter the situation. The rest of the world just seemed to melt away into the slipstream of time. All too soon, he was drawn from his euphoria by a familiar voice, one that he recognized easily after spending so much time with the man. Jiraiya called out to him, "Hey, kid, ready to go?" "Sure, Ero Sennin," Naruto said, laughing as Jiraiya fumed. "I thought I told you not to call me that." Jiraiya yelled angrily, a vein throbbing dangerously on his forehead and pounding against his Hitai-8. Naruto only laughed harder, walking past the elder man. "Naruto-kun." Naruto stopped laughing and turned around, only to be hit with the force equivalent to a torpedo as an indigo-haired girl threw herself into his arms, squeezing him tight. Oof. Naruto gasped as the air was expelled forcefully from his lungs, Hinata clinging to him as though he were the only thing keeping her alive. His look of surprise melted away and he gently wrapped his arms around her, smiling peacefully. "Hey, Hinata-chan," he whispered, trying to calm his heart as it sped away, reacting to her close presence. She buried her face in his shoulder, suddenly aware that he had grown several inches over the span of the month before the finals. Naruto's eyes went wide as saucers as she leaned up and planted a warm kiss on his lips, her own pair so soft and gentle that he felt like he had died and gone to heaven. As she pulled back, a blush lit up both their faces. Smiling shyly, she whispered to him, "Stay safe, Naruto-kun." A loud laugh broke the moment, wolf whistles being sent their way. Jiraiya cackled gleefully, a notepad in his palms as he called out to the blonde boy, yelling, "Way to go, Naruto." Naruto turned a glare at the elder man as he continued to laugh, and then moved his attention back onto the girl in his arms. Smiling, he pulled her into a warm hug, whispering gently into her ear, "I'll see you later, Hinata-chan." Letting her go, he turned back towards the road, gesturing to the old ninja with a scowl on his lips, "Come on, you old lecher, let's get going." Hinata couldn't help but giggle as Jiraiya fumed at his new student, chasing after Naruto and swinging his notepad around for emphasis. They'd be gone for a little while, but they would be back soon enough. Oh, yeah, Naruto reached into his pack and pulled out a small scroll, one that the old man had given him the day before the Chunin exams. He unfurled it and started reading. I wonder what Asen had to say. Naruto's eyes zipped back and forth as he read the shocking words on the scroll, his mouth slowly falling open. He whispered, "No way." "What?" Jiraiya looked back at him with a curious expression on his face. Naruto stuttered, "Nothing." He turned his attention back to the scroll and read it over again. "Dear Naruto-kun, if you are reading this, then I must have died fighting Orochimaru at the Chunin exam finals. Whether or not he has died as well is not known to me, though I am sure I tried my hardest. The information I am about to disclose must be made known to the new Hokage as long as you believe he or she to be trustworthy enough. I'm sure you remember the Anbu that I had look after you when you were younger. In particular, I speak of the weasel-masked Anbu, whose real name was Uchiha Itachi. If you have not already heard, he wiped out his entire family several years ago, leaving only young Sasuke behind. He has since been declared an S-rank missing ninja. What was never made public, Naruto-kun, was that he killed the Uchiha clan on my orders in order to stop the next advent of Uchiha Madara, the most dangerous man in Konoha history. Only myself, Itachi, Homura, Kaharu, and Danzo know of this, and I assure you that they would not tell anyone. Itachi-kun is powerful. There are not many ninja of his caliber and most of them are rogues. It has become necessary, however, to bring him back. Something disturbing is on the horizon, Naruto-kun, and we need Itachi-kun in Konoha more than anything. Do what you can to ensure that he is brought back home. On a more personal note, Naruto-kun, I believe it is time for you to know the truth about your heritage. I am sorry to have kept it from you for so long, but you will be slightly relieved to know that they are both dead, so they didn't abandon you. It was my intention not to tell you until later on, when you had grown some more and were strong enough to hold your own against some of the best, but you have grown faster than I anticipated. For that reason, I can tell you that you are Namikaze Naruto, son of the Yondaime Hokage, Namikaze Minato, and his wife, Uzumaki Kushina. Your parents would be proud of you, Naruto-kun, just as I am, and your father would be disappointed in his village. If nothing else, remember, Naruto-kun, that they loved you enough to die to keep you safe." The old man, Sarutobi Jisen Naruto, rolled the scroll up and bit his lip to keep from tearing up. Kakashi leaned against the wall of a small restaurant, more of a simple dango shop than anything, his hands tucked inside of his pockets. He was waiting for his student, Uchiha Sasuke, to show up, so that they could get some training done. Naruto, he knew, was going on a trip with Jiraiya to look for Tsunade. Beyond that, however, Kakashi was also keeping an eye on the two suspicious men sitting inside of the establishment he was leaning on. After hearing of the Akatsuki from Jiraiya, anyone suspicious that entered the village was a potential member of the dangerous group, so he would not let them out of his sight. Besides, one of the men seemed awfully familiar, in an ominous and foreboding sort of way. If his suspicions were correct, they could be in a great deal of trouble. Kakashi looked up as Kurenai and Asuma walked down the street side by side towards him. "Hey, you two, you look good together. Are you on a date or something?" "Idiot." Kurenai blushed scarlet, glaring at him. "Anko asked me to pick up some dango for her." "What about you, Kakashi?" Asuma asked, grinning. "You picking up sweets, too?" "No." Kakashi smiled beneath his mask. "I'm actually meeting Sasuke here. I'm waiting for him." Kakashi's eye narrowed almost imperceptibly as the shorter of the two suspicious men tightened his grip on the clay mug of tea in his hand, the material groaning under the pressure of his strength. If Asuma and Kurenai noticed, they didn't show it as Asuma said, with a smirk, "It's very rare to see you waiting on someone." "Kakashi," Sasuke walked up, his usual scowl in place, "it's very different for you to arrive first." "Well," Kakashi smiled beneath his mask, "for some occasions." Sasuke glanced inside the dango shop to see a plate of dango and two steaming, half-full mugs of tea sitting at an empty table, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Kakashi nodded to the other two Junin standing across from him and they both disappeared, leaving the copy nin alone with his student. Asuma and Kurenai followed the mysterious men all the way to a walkway by Konoha's river system, standing in front of the two with a serious look on each of their faces. The strange, cloak-wearing figures stopped, the shorter of the two lifting his hat as if to get a better look at them. "It's been a while," the shorter one said, his red eyes peering into theirs. "Asuma-san, Kurenai-san." "You," Kurenai gasped, eyes wide in surprise and a slight bit of fear. "Hey," Asuma's cigarette twitched as he spoke, "there's no doubt about it." The shorter man took his hat off, then unsnapped part of his cloak, resting his left arm in it like a sling. He stared at them impassively, his black hair swaying slightly in the wind. Asuma's eyes narrowed. Uchiha Itachi. So, the taller man said, taking his hat off as well, I see you already know Itachi. Guess I better introduce myself as well. He threw the hat away, grinning at the two Junin with shark teeth, Hoshigaki Kisame. Pleased to meet you. Itachi, Asuma scowled, you're pretty brave to come back here after what you did. Itachi didn't respond, but Asuma could have sworn he glimpsed a small amount of regret deep in those bloody eyes. It was gone before he could confirm it, so he just shook it off as his own imagination. Hey, Kisame chuckled, your village doesn't seem too fond of you, Itachi. Asuma-san, Kurenai-san, please do not interfere with my affairs, Itachi said calmly. I would prefer not to kill you. That's a pretty strange thing to hear from your mouth, Itachi, Asuma said. After all, you didn't have a problem with slaying your entire clan. There were circumstances beyond your knowledge, Itachi told him, the first traces of a scowl crossing his lips. If you knew what I do, then you would be thanking me. What's your purpose for being here? Kurenai asked, her gaze firm. Kisame swung his large package off of his back into the concrete, grinning toothily, enough small talk. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Don't kill them, Itachi warned, just make sure they can't get back to the village to stop us. Kisame suddenly lashed out, making a vertical slash with his sword. Asuma drew his trench knives, crossing the blades together to form an X-shaped block that stopped clothed weapon short. Asuma grinned as Kurenai flashed through hand seals and disappeared into thin air. Steadily, however, Kisami's weapon lowered itself until it rested against Asuma's upper biceps, proving that Kisame indeed had an advantage in strength. The fish-like man grinned as the bandages on his sword were torn to shreds, revealing the true form of his infamous and formidable blade. He yanked it backwards, dragging its surface over Asuma's arm and causing a good deal of damage. My Samahata doesn't cut, it shaves. As Kisame pulled his sword back for another strike, his legs began to sink into the ground. Simultaneously, tree roots shot from the ground and wound their way around Itachi's prone form, ensnaring him in their trap. Kurenai emerged from the tree a few feet above Itachi's head, kunai poised to kill him as she said, this is the end. In an instant, Kurenai was the one trapped in the tree and Itachi was standing in front of her. His gaze impassive, genjutsu of this level has no effect on me, Kurenai-san. Scowling, Kurenai bit her lip in an attempt to release the genjutsu, freeing herself just in time to block a kick from Itachi that sent her into the river. Kurenai, Asuma yelled, even as Kisame lifted his sword up for another strike, one-handed. Not paying attention will get you killed, Kisame smirked. As expected of Kurenai-san, Itachi told Kurenai, standing behind her as she sat up on the water surface. This is it, a voice said behind the Uchiha, for you. Asuma ducked under the second slash, moving in as the man hefted his sword once more. He shot a punch at Kisami's head, missing by several centimeters as the fish man tilted to the left slightly. Regardless, a cut carved itself into the missing nin's cheek, bleeding sluggishly. Sweden, Kisame flashed through hand seals, water swirling around him. Suikuden on Jutsu, a voice called in time with his, unleashing an identical attack simultaneously. The two techniques twisted together, negating each other and splashing back to the ground. A silver-haired Junin stood in front of Asuma, glaring at Kisame, and a second one stood behind Itachi holding a kunai out threateningly. Kage Bunshin, Kurenai muttered, glancing at the Kakashi that stood behind the Uchiha. Hatake Kakashi, Itachi turned his head, gazing into Kakashi's Sharingan eye with his own. His eyes quickly darted over to Kisame. Move, Kisame. Huh? The blue-skinned man asked incredulously. Against a single opponent, you would resolve this matter quickly, Itachi told him. However, you are about to face multiple opponents, which would take a great deal more time. Time is something we don't have, and we did not come here to die. Then why are you here? Kakashi asked, the Kage Bunshin on the land dissipating into smoke. We're looking for something, Itachi said plainly. Kakashi flashed through hand seals, Sweden, Sujinheki. The jutsu aimed at him from all sides collided with his water wall, stopping short of its target. Kakashi glared as the liquid fell back into the river, wary of any tricks his enemy might pull. You are skilled, as expected, Itachi said, his face calm. A second Uchiha stabbed Kakashi in the back, isn't that right? Kakashi dissolved into water and Kurenai saw her chance, reaching for a kunai to strike the Itachi in front of her. Kakashi suddenly leapt at her, pulling her beneath the water as the man she had been about to kill exploded, singeing the copy nin's back. For someone who is not of Uchiha blood, you are quite skilled with that eye, Kakashi-san. Itachi closed his eyes. Now, I shall show you the true power of the Sharingan. Close your eyes, now, Kakashi commanded, leaving only his Sharingan open. The silver-haired Junin's breath caught in his throat as Itachi's eyes opened, then he collapsed to his knees, panting as though he had run a marathon. His body ached with phantom pains, as though he actually had been stabbed thousands of times in the span of 72 hours. Goo, Kakashi groaned, fighting to stay conscious. You're after Sasuke, aren't you? No, Itachi said calmly, his penetrating gaze stabbing into Kakashi's soul. We are after the Yondaim's legacy. What? Kakashi asked incredulously. What do you want with him? Your target, it's the Kyuubi inside of Naruto, isn't it? Your organization, Akatsuki. Itachi tensed, eyes wide, then he glanced to his right almost imperceptibly before his shoulders seemed to sag in relief. In a tense tone, he said, Kisame, take Kakashi-san out. Kisame hefted his sword, dashing towards Kakashi with the intention of killing the silver-haired man. A green blur leapt from the trees to his right, colliding with him in a cry of, Konoha Goriki Senpu. A tall man with a bowl cut wearing a green spandex suit stood straight, grinning charmingly, Konoha's green beast. Maida guy. Kisame stood, rubbing his cheek gingerly and glaring at the Junin, you're Konoha's green beast, huh? I think I'll just call you an exotic animal. Kakashi suddenly pitched forward into the water, unconscious. Guy lifted him onto his shoulder, glaring at Itachi fiercely. There was a heavy pause where Itachi seemed to be considering his options, then he spoke. Kisame, Itachi said calmly. We're leaving. In a blur, both Itachi and his partner disappeared from Konoha, leaving nothing behind but their hats. All three Junin relaxed, glad that the threat had left for the moment. One sentence rang throughout Kakashi's mind, piercing through his skull even in his unconscious state. Kakashi-san, please, take care of Naruto-kun for me. Naruto rose from the comfortable bed with a loud, angry sigh, his right eyebrow twitching dangerously as he moved towards the door to his spacious hotel room. It had been a day or two since he and the perverted old man had left Konoha searching for this Tsunade woman. Jiraiya had just blown him off so that he could go mess around with some hot girl that had given him nothing more than a wink. I'm coming, Naruto shouted as a second, much more insistent knock resounded throughout the room, echoing off of the walls. Suppressing a growl as a third knock pounded against the heavy wooden door, he took a calming breath to cool his anger. When he was sure he wouldn't blow up at his guests, he opened the hotel door and greeted the two men behind it with a bright smile and a friendly, hello. Hello, Naruto-kun, came the return greeting from a young, black-haired teen, his long locks tied, for the most part, in a ponytail at the nape of his neck. His red eyes swirled with the legendary Sharingan, his impassive gaze flickering with hesitation for a second as if he were unsure about doing his task. We'd like you to come with us. A taller, blue-skinned man stood next to him, gazing down at Naruto with a skeptical look. Is this Brad really the Kyuubi's vessel? Come out of the room, the black-haired teen said firmly, and Naruto felt himself obeying, stepping outside of the room's safety. All right, the blue man cried excitedly, grasping the hilt of the object on his back. Let's get this started. After all, we don't need him running away. Let's cut off a leg. Naruto suddenly realized that he was in danger, and that his Hitai-8 was sitting over on the bed with the rest of the stuff he had packed. Scowling, he yanked his sword free at an impressive speed, swinging it towards the teenager. The teen held up two fingers, blocking the blade effortlessly. He frowned, however, as blood began to trickle down his hand. He had indeed blocked the sword, but it had still cut into his skin, despite his fingers being reinforced with chakra to protect them. That was most troubling. TCH, Naruto's scowl deepened as he pulled back his sword, standing straight with his eyes narrowed. Let's take this somewhere a bit more open. In a blur, all three of them vanished from the hallway. Uchiha Sasuke rounded the corner a second later, staring at the door that had been left ajar in the empty hall that stood before him, baffled and feeling as if he had missed something important that may have changed something fundamental about his world. The three ninja appeared once more in a huge clearing outside of the city, a large building standing at the edge of one side and a wall of trees guarding the other. Naruto scowled at the two men across from him, gauging their strength and the amount of power he would need to beat them. He sighed. "I don't suppose you guys would just leave, huh?" he asked, receiving narrowed eyes from the teen and a dark chuckle from the fish man. He gripped his sword tightly. "Very well." A bright aura lit up around him, casting deep shadows against the trees and shocking his enemies. He swung his sword forward, his voice cold and calm, "Bankai." There was a blinding flash of light, forcing the two Akatsuki members to look away in fear of blindness. Seconds later, the flash died down and the two of them stared at the creature that now stood before them. Wings of ice spread outward, giving a single, bird-like flap. They were attached to his back, covering his shoulders with a protective layer. Beneath the wings was a large tail of ice that flicked back and forth, as if it belonged to him. A thick layer of jagged ice covered the blonde's right arm, encasing his fist and the hilt of his sword in a dragon's head. His feet were covered in ice as well, forming what appeared to be a dragon's paws. His left arm, from elbow to wrist, was also covered in ice, a claw-like paw attached to the wrist. The hilt guard on the sword appeared to be the only thing that had changed about the katana, morphing into an 8-point star. 4 ice flowers, each with 4 petals, hovered around the blonde's form. Naruto's eyes were frigid blue, Daiguren Hyo Rin Maru. Great crimson lotus ice ring. A thin layer of ice covered the ground, merging the grass and dirt into one solid mass of flat frozen liquid. It seemed to stretch the length of the clearing, and even farther, if the frosted trees and bushes were any measure. The sky above had darkened with black clouds, blocking out most of the sunlight. "You sure this is the Kyuubi brat?" the blue-skinned man asked his companion. The teen merely nodded in response. With a battle cry, Naruto left the ground, soaring towards the shark man with his sword poised to stab through him. Too surprised to move, Naruto's blade sank into the blue-skinned freak's chest, piercing through the other side like a hot knife through a slab of butter. Ice spread rapidly from the point of contact, freezing over the ninja's body and creating a long line of ice behind that man that was easily half as tall him. Naruto scowled as the man trapped in his ice vanished in a poof of smoke, revealing him to be a Kage Bunshin disguised as his enemy. Naruto turned cold eyes towards the two men, realizing that he just might be out of his league. "Phew," the blue-skinned man sighed in relief. "That was close. Thanks for saving me, Itachi." "Itachi." Naruto's eyes widened, then took on an angry gleam. "Itachi, I." He charged forward again, his left hand slipping into his kunai pouch under the cover of his wing. Surprised at the sudden outburst, Itachi barely dodged the blade as it cut through his cloak just inches from the left side of stomach, bent over with his head near Naruto's right shoulder. He was even more stunned as he realized that the charge had merely been a distraction, as Naruto's left hand pushed something into his right sleeve, a scroll. "I know the truth," the blonde whispered into his ears, "Itachi Nissen." "Then you know," Itachi whispered back, pressing his still bleeding fingers against Naruto's bare forehead. The blood trickled down into Naruto's eyes, which flashed red for a second as he blinked, "That I will always protect you, Ototo." With a gentle strength, Itachi pushed Naruto back several yards, watching as the blonde steadied himself effortlessly. Muttering under his breath, Naruto held out his free hand, palm forward, and recited a single sentence, "Hado no Sanjusen, Sokatsui." A ball of blue fire shot forward, scattering both of the black-cloaked ninja. The moment Kisame landed, Naruto was upon him, stabbing. The blue-skinned man leaned backwards, the silvery sword slicing a small cut into his clothes at the shoulder. There was a second stab and Kisame ducked under this one, too, undamaged. With a grunt, Naruto swung his sword instead of stabbing, watching as Kisame leapt over it almost gracefully, flipping and landing behind him. Spinning on the spot, Naruto let loose another slash, cutting right through his foe. Kisame splashed into water, which froze before it could even completely lose its shape. Growling, Naruto stabbed one of the pieces of ice, skewering it. Hefting it, he swung again and the huge chunk shot forward. It shattered completely against the thick bulk of Samahata. Kisame's grin revealed a mouth full of row upon row of sharp, pointed teeth that fit his shark-like appearance oddly well. Naruto smirked, bringing his free hand up into a flurry of hand seals. Upon the last one, he declared, "Sensatsu Susho." The shattered pieces of ice quickly melted, morphing into a tight cage of 1,000 water needles. A look of shock crossed Kisami's face for a moment, then he was skewered, only to fall apart into water once more. The real one was standing a short distance away, his grin still stretching across his face. Naruto scowled, his grip on his sword tightening. Then, he vanished, reappearing several feet in front of Kisame with his sword poised to strike. The blue-skinned man swung down at the same time as Naruto swung diagonally. With a loud clang, the swords met in a ferocious battle of steel. Then, with apparent ease, Hyo-Rin-Maru cleaved right through Samahata, cutting the large sword in half at the middle. The larger half, the one that was all blade and no hilt, flew off in the direction of Naruto's strike, landing several yards away on the ice. Naruto's slit pupils gazed up at Kisame as he spoke. Hyo-Rin-Maru and I predicted the thickness, density, and durability of your blade and strengthened our own accordingly. This allowed us to destroy your weapon, and thus, the main point of your attack. If I had used chakra, you may still have your sword. It seems, however, that Samahata is intolerable of Raryoku. Kisame actually growled, "Why, you little Kisame," Itachi warned, "we're leaving. Jiraiya-sama will be here soon." "Tch," Kisame scoffed, "next time, brat, I'll kill you." In a blur, both of them vanished. "This is Tanzaku guy?" Naruto asked, staring at the destroyed area in front of him, the remains of a decimated castle. Jiraiya nodded solemnly. Had a larger area been affected by the carnage, natural disaster might have been a believable excuse for the destruction that had occurred, but such wasn't the case. The castle was all that had been razed to the ground, so the culprit could only have been a summoned animal of some sort, or one of the tailed beasts. "This has Tsunade written all over it," Jiraiya said calmly, a frown on his lips. "By the way, how far have you gotten on that Rasengan?" "I'm still having a bit of trouble with stage 3, but it shouldn't take me much longer to figure it out." Naruto glanced at Jiraiya. "Should we really be discussing my progress when we're searching for Tsunade?" "No, I suppose not," Jiraiya admitted. "But, it's too late in the day to do much of anything, so let's go eat some dinner, huh?" Nodding, Naruto followed Jiraiya dutifully as the elder man led him to a restaurant nearby. The moment he stepped inside, he was viciously assaulted by the quiet noise of the pub and no one seemed to notice his entrance. He might as well have dropped a pin in the middle of this calamity, he may have actually gotten more attention. "Speak of the devil," Jiraiya muttered, looking at something that Naruto couldn't pinpoint. The elder man's appearance suddenly took on one of excitement as he waved, calling out cheerfully, "Tsunade Heim." A blonde woman, apparently Tsunade, looked up at them, startled. "Jiraiya. What are you doing here?" Naruto looked at the woman as Jiraiya led him through the crowd and onto the couch stool that sat on the opposite side of Tsunade's table. Somehow, when he had heard of the great Tsunade, he had expected a wrinkled old woman that could rival Jiraiya in terms of age. But before him sat a beautiful woman who seemed to be somewhere in her mid-20s. Then there was the girl who sat with the blonde-haired slug Sennin, and she seemed to be about Kakashi's age, if he were any accurate a guess. She seemed like the timid type, one who didn't often speak up out of turn. She seemed kind of subdued, though Naruto had no idea why. "Today," Tsunade broke the awkward silence, "I met with someone who brings back a lot of bad memories." "Orochimaru, you mean?" Jiraiya asked, absently noting the sudden anger Naruto was trying to squash. "Did anything happen?" Tsunade shot a quick glare at Shizune, then responded nonchalantly, "Nothing much. Just a little greeting." She gave him a look. "You're here, too," she pointed out. "Why, what's the reason for this unexpected reunion?" Jiraiya fixed her with a serious stare. "Konoha's elder council has issued a request for you to become the Godime Hokage." Both girls' eyes widened, a shocked look passing over their faces. Naruto stared at him incredulously, then looked back and forth between the two members of the Sannin, wondering if he had heard right. This blonde woman was going to become Hokage. Why wasn't he told? The third, Jiraiya looked down sadly. "Sarutobi-sensei is. Orochimaru told me," Tsunade said, her expression stoic. "It was his work." "You met with Orochimaru?" Naruto asked her heatedly. "And you didn't kill him?" "Who is this brat?" Tsunade asked Jiraiya. "He's Uzumaki." "I'm Namikaze Naruto," the blonde boy interrupted, standing up, "and and he's made it his personal mission to kill Orochimaru," Jiraiya interjected, pulling the kid back into his seat. He gave the blonde a wary look, slightly alarmed that he knew his true heritage. He changed the subject. So, what's your answer? There was a long pause, as though she was thinking about it, considering the offer. Then, I decline. What? Naruto stood up again, glaring at her. Konoha offers you the position of Hokage on a silver platter and you simply turn it away like yesterday's news. Damn you, this is important. Tsunade chuckled. Jiraiya, this brat is worse than your previous student, in terms of looks, speech, and intelligence. It's hard to compete with the fourth, Jiraiya started. He had the talent that only comes alone once per generation. He was like me, smart, reliable, and handsome. But even the fourth died quickly, Tsunade said bitterly. He sacrificed himself for his village. Life is different from money. It can't be gambled so easily, and whoever does is a fool. If you have nothing you would die for, Naruto hissed quietly, eyes narrowed, then you're not truly alive. Jiraiya frowned in disappointment. You've changed, Tsunade. Age changes people. She waved her hand, as if brushing off the question, but only a fool would be Hokage. Plates and food jumped off the table as Naruto tried to jump over it, intent on beating her up. Jiraiya had grabbed him by the back of his vest, preventing his blonde student from jumping into a battle he had no hope of winning. Naruto glared at her, scowling as if he had practiced it for years. Let me go, Jiraiya. Naruto growled. No one says that about Tusen or Asen. You do realize we're in a bar, don't you? Jiraiya asked rhetorically. I don't care if she's a woman. Naruto hissed. I'm going to beat the shit out of her. Tsunade stood up, glaring at Naruto as she planted one foot up on the table. You've got guts to say that to me. Let's take this outside. Tsunade smirked, standing about 10 yards from Naruto, holding up her right index finger. I've been one of the Sannin since before you were even born. I don't have to take this seriously. One finger should do. I wouldn't be so quick to judge, Tsunade Haim, Jiraiya warned her as Naruto seethed. He shows even more promise than Minato-kun. If you won't take me seriously, Naruto said coldly as he yanked his sword from its sheath. Then I'll just have to force you. He rushed her, swinging his sword in a downward arc. She ducked inside his guard, poking his sword arm with enough force to jerk it backwards, then reached into his kunai holster and grabbed one with a single finger. She spun it into a reverse grip, slashing upwards with enough force to dislodge his Hitai-8. Naruto tried to steady himself, moving his feet until he was sure he wouldn't fall. Then he turned his gaze back to his opponent, shocked to see a finger poised to hit his forehead. With more strength than he believed she could have possessed, she flicked him with her index finger, sending him flying several yards back into the ground. Why are you so obsessed with the Hokage title? Tsunade asked, her hands on hips. Because it's my dream to be Hokage. Naruto shouted at her. Tsunade looked down distractedly, biting her lip as if she were faced with some unthinkable decision. Che, Naruto scoffed as he stood, rubbing his forehead. I guess Bankai would be too big for such an enclosed street like this. He stabbed his sword into the ground, flashing through hand seals as he called out the name of his technique, Kinjutsu, Ninpo, Ryujin no Terai. Advent of the Dragon God. Tsunade whispered bewilderedly. What kind of technique is? His flesh rippled as the muscles beneath them condensed and strengthened, his pupils thinning and lengthening into slits instead of the normal round circles. There was a sickening squelch as a black feathered wing tore itself free from his back and his shirt, folding up against his side. In a blur of motion, Naruto and his sword vanished, reappearing behind Tsunade and swinging downwards. The blonde woman turned around, stopping the gleaming silver blade with her index and middle fingers. She glared at him as he smirked at her, his animalistic eyes shining in the moonlight that roved over his face. And, she noticed, he was hovering in midair, his feet level with her knees. We could have sworn you said something about only one finger, Naruto said, his voice deeper and cooler, a certain smoothness to it that hadn't been there before. It's impressive that you're not bleeding, but whatever happened to beating us with a single finger, Tsunade Haim? Watch your mouth, brat, Tsunade growled, glaring at him. Oh dear, we're sorry. We've been such a bad boy, the blonde said, rearing his free hand back. Chakra gathered, swirling in his palm dangerously. We haven't quite gotten this thing down, but we dare say it should be good enough. The hand jerked forward, an unstable ball of white chakra hovering above it as Naruto cried out, Rasengan. Tsunade leapt backwards, watching as the orb flew through the spot she had just vacated and collided with the solid ground, carving a deep gouge in the earth. She could only look on in amazement as he stood back up and grinned at her, the bruise on his forehead from her earlier attack already healed. Jiraiya. She suddenly rounded on her old teammate, glaring at him. Was it you who taught him those techniques? Rasengan and this, Ryujin no Jirai. The Rasengan I can lay claim to, Jiraiya said calmly. After all, if only in principle, I am his teacher. The other thing, though, it looks remarkable like my sage mode, but I would never teach him such a thing. He neglected to mention that he had shown it to the kid, though. Teaching him something he can't learn and pretending to be his teacher, you're a fool, she replied, venom in her voice. It's better if he doesn't think that way, so that he won't joke about idiotic dreams like becoming Hokage. It's not a joke, hag. Naruto yelled at her, face twisted in rage as his wing twitched angrily. Give us 3 days and we'll have the technique figured out. Tsunade's eyebrow twitched. Is that a bet? Naruto smirked. What are the stakes? I'll give you 1 week, she also smirked. If you can master the Rasengan in that time, I'll acknowledge your skill and give this necklace. She thumbed the pendant around her neck, but if you lose, all your money is mine. Deal. Deal. Naruto stared at his handiwork as his clones disappeared and their knowledge became his, proud that he had managed to get so far into the completion of his Rasengan. It had taken the better part of the week, but all of his hard work and determination had paid off. He grinned at the demolished tree, upon which was a hole that put to shame the one Jiraiya had made in demonstration. The landscape had changed drastically since he had started his training. In the beginning, it had been a small river surrounded by an ocean of stones and a few lush trees. While it hadn't been the prettiest sight in the world, it certainly held some measure of aesthetic quality to it. It had been a healthy environment. Now, however, that landscape had changed drastically from what it had been into what it was. Several of the rocks had been demolished and destroyed, leaving behind nothing but faint blankets of dust and pebble. The trees, once lush and bearing lively green foliage, had been torn to shreds by the sheer power of the Rasengan. Naruto looked up at the last remaining tree, standing tall and proud amongst its fallen brethren and the rocks that had lost any sense of shape or form. He grinned, gathering chakra into the bare palm of his right hand. An orb came to life, rotating at high speeds a few centimeters above his palm. With a war cry, Naruto charged the tree, right hand held back as he rushed forward. He thrust his hand forth, at the tree, and called out the name of his technique, the name of the Yondaim's technique, Rasengan. The orb of chakra buried itself into the trunk of the tree, digging into the bark and carving a hole the size of a volleyball into the thick, sturdy wood. There was a whining sound, like that of chainsaw cutting into a tree, and several grooves carved themselves into the thick bark and wood around the hole. Naruto jumped back as the tree began to fall over, grinning at his success with the supposed A-rank jutsu Jiraiya had taught to him. Tomorrow, when he went to show Tsunade how far he had made it, she would be surprised to see that he had mastered the jutsu that she had said he couldn't. His grin widened. She should know better than to bet against him. Tsunade stood against Kabuto, Orochimaru's assistant, and Orochimaru himself. The fight had only begun a little while ago, but a tie seemed imminent. Orochimaru, without use of his arms, was almost useless, but with Kabuto helping him, they made a powerful team. Shizune, a drugged and sluggish Jiraiya, and Naruto all arrived on the scene, skidding to a halt a score of yards away from the battle. Naruto narrowed his eyes as he caught sight of the silver-haired boy standing next to the snake Sennin. Tsunade was frozen, covered in blood not her own. Kabuto, Naruto growled, so, you've been working for the snake perv all this time. My, Naruto-kun, Kabuto drawled, fixing his glasses, so you finally noticed. You're so thick, Naruto-kun. That's why you can't compare to Sasuke-kun. Naruto glared, his eyes turning into chips of ice. Even if you make such a scary face at me, you're nothing more than an out-of-place genin, Kabuto told him. For a genin, you have some skill, but with the Sannin in front of me, you're worthless. TCH, Naruto scowled as he unsheathed his sword, holding it out in front of himself. His lips curled around the word as he said it in a thick, strong voice. Bankai. The wings, tail, claws, and gauntlet all formed instantly, followed quickly by 4 flowers, each with as many petals. The guard on the sword doubled, taking on 4 more points to the already 4-pointed star. Blue eyes narrowed as the sky above darkened, a light sprinkling of snow beginning to fall. Orochimaru was lucky before, he said, glaring at Kabuto, who seemed unaffected. If he had been alone in that box, I would easily have cleaved his head from his shoulders. As it is, that gray-haired freak of his got in a lucky shot. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Big talk from a genin, Kabuto said calmly. What makes you think you can actually take on Orochimaru-sama? He has several years of experience on you and everyone in the entirety of the elemental nations recognizes him as one of the strongest ninja ever. He'll crush you, effortlessly. Snarling, Naruto sent a hail of ice spikes towards his enemy in response, watching as Kabuto easily dodged it, leaping backwards. When he landed, however, he quickly discovered that Naruto had completely vanished, as if he had never been standing there in the first place. The blonde reappeared out of nowhere, stabbing forward from behind the gray-haired ninja and skewering Kabuto through his chest and out the other side. Ice leapt from the point of contact, consuming the body of the silver-haired teen. In under a second, Kabuto was standing upright inside a frozen coffin, undoubtedly dead on his feet. Naruto scowled as the boy inside the ice transformed into a wooden log, turning around to face the real Kabuto as he slowly rose from the ground next to Orochimaru. There was a smirk on the teen's lips, his dark eyes gleaming as he slowly adjusted his glasses with a single finger. Sunlight reflected off of his sound village Hitai-8. Naruto's expression suddenly turned dark and angry. Orochimaru, for what you've done, I'll kill you. In a blur of shunpo, Naruto was instantly high in the air, swinging his sword down, Hyo-Rin-Maru. A winding blue water dragon with glowing red eyes wound its way around Naruto, then roared as it rushed towards its targets. Without the command phrase, Kabuto asked incredulously, eyes wide, but he's supposed to need the command phrase to activate that power. Kabuto and Orochimaru leapt back away as the dragon collided with the ground, dispersing but leaving behind a large spike of ice. Kabuto gathered some of his blood on his finger as the bandages on Orochimaru's left arm unraveled themselves. Simultaneously, Naruto landed and both he and Jiraiya bit their thumbs before making their own seals, even as the icy appendages on Naruto's back and arms and legs dissipated into nothingness. Kuchio's no jutsu, 4 voices cried out simultaneously. In a humongous plume of smoke, 4 tall entities appeared on the field. Manda, the purple boss of the snake summoning style, Katsuya, the pale boss for the slug summoning style, Gamabunta, the orange boss of the toads and their summoning style, and Hyo-Rin-Maru, the giant blue dragon of the sword in Naruto's hands. Katsuya and Tsunade, and Orochimaru and Manda, it's been a while, Gamabunta said calmly, puffing on his pipe. But I don't recognize that strange-looking upstart Naruto-kun is standing on. Looks like a dragon. Hyo-Rin-Maru looked up at Naruto, when you wrote that contract for me, I didn't actually expect you to use it. Neither did I, Naruto admitted, gaze locked onto Orochimaru. I didn't think I'd ever face another person capable of summoning, let alone someone who could call on a boss. The dragon's claws dug into the dirt, carving deep gouges into the earth. Somehow, this just became an entirely different battle. You, Manda just seemed to notice Gamabunta. Maybe I should turn you into toad jerky. Hey, Gamabunta reached for his sword. I've always wanted a snake skin wallet. This is quite the reunion, Katsuya mumbled. Manda didn't respond, instead looking up at the man standing on his head. You owe me 100 sacrifices for this, Orochimaru. You'll get your sacrifices, Orochimaru hissed back, just as soon as you. Now, Naruto called. Hyo-Rin-Maru dove forward, clamping its jaws onto Manda's neck as Naruto disappeared in a blur. Manda turned its head angrily, hissing as he glared at the dragon whose teeth were trying to rip out his throat, you insolent whelp. Let go of me. Naruto reappeared atop Manda's head, the beast's eyes moving to stare at him. What? Now, Naruto reared his hand back, an orb of glowing chakra spinning above it. He shoved it into Kabuto's stomach, delighting in the look on the traitor's face. Rasengan. Kabuto pitched backward, falling off of Manda and to the unforgiving earth below. His fate was sealed. Should he collide with the ground falling at terminal velocity and without any form of cushion to lessen his descent, he would die. And the only one even slightly willing to save him was Orochimaru. Damn you, you brat, the snake Sennin cried angrily, leaping off of the boss summon. Hyo-Rin-Maru, Naruto called over his shoulder, his gaze flickering to the massive blue dragon still biting Manda. Right, Hyo-Rin-Maru answered, clenching his powerful jaws as hard as he could and digging his claws into the ground for leverage. With an audible snap, Manda's spine broke and the summon boss disappeared in a plume of smoke, hissing curses at the dragon that had done him in. Orochimaru wrapped his long tongue around Kabuto's body, channeling chakra to his legs as he held his faithful servant aloft. He hit the ground with a loud thud, a sharp tingling pain shooting up his legs, despite the chakra cushion he had used to guard against such a thing. He glared up at the blonde, who was once more standing atop his blue dragon summon. Growling angrily at his humiliating defeat, at the hands of a genin, no less, he and Kabuto sank into the ground. He would have his revenge, someday. He swore on it. Damn that brat, Kisame growled angrily, making an aggressive poke at the fire before him with a long stick. The coals churned at his ministrations, spewing sparks and flames as the blaze rose several feet, then dropped back down to its previous level. Yuji. Kisame stabbed the fire a second time, watching the flames rise up as if in anger, then fall back down as if they had been doused. It wouldn't bring his sword back, but it sure as hell made him feel a bit better about losing it. I'm gonna kill that brat. Itachi ignored him, his Sharingan eyes poring over the text held in his hands. To any outward observer, he was casually reading the scroll that he was holding, taking in its information without really absorbing it. Anyone who knew him well enough, however, would notice that he was biting his bottom lip, lost in thought. Something disturbing is on the horizon, Naruto-kun, and we need Itachi-kun in Konoha more than anything. Do what you can to ensure that he is brought back home. Itachi reread the scroll, his eyes burning the words into memory like a cattle brand. He glanced over at his partner, Hoshigaki Kisame, the largest obstacle he would face in his return. If he wished to do as the Sandaime desired, then he would have to abandon his post as spy and make contact with Naruto again. Hey, Itachi. Itachi looked over at the shark man, who was chewing on some fish he had managed to catch earlier. Kisame held up another fish, offering it to him. Want some? Itachi turned his head away and Kisame took that as a no, shoveling the fish down like a starving man. In under 10 seconds, the entire thing was picked clean to the bone and the blue-skinned swordsman was smacking his lips with satisfaction. It disgusted him. Itachi turned again, looking at his partner with an unreadable expression on his face, Kisame. Kisame looked up at him, then froze, too shocked to do anything but watch as the cold steel of Itachi's kunai dove for his head, aimed for right between his eyes. There was a stabbing feeling, the feeling of the metal piercing his flesh, and then all went black. Itachi stood straight, wiping his kunai clean of blood and placing it back in its holster. He turned back to the fire and stretched his senses out, but couldn't find any trace of the mysterious Zetsu. That meant that he had several days, or even longer, before the Akatsuki became aware of his betrayal. As he glanced back at the blue-skinned man, Itachi couldn't help but feel a slight bit of satisfaction. Hoshigaki Kisame was dead. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. The next part will be out soon.